Winter in Bavaria, 1922, lay heavy across the land. The fields were blanketed white, the air sharp as knives, every sound muted under the weight of ice. In the village, chimneys smoked and shutters rattled, but on the edge of the forest, Hinterkaifeck farm stood alone, an island of timber and stone in a sea of snow. It was there on a morning in late March that something strange appeared. Footprints. They began at the tree line, boots pressed deep into the snow, step after step straight as a line drawn with a ruler. The trail cut across the field toward the farmhouse. The strange part was not that the tracks came, it was that they never left. No return path, no circle back, just one way in and nothing out. The neighbors noticed first. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, passing with two men, stopped at the edge of the field. He frowned, squinting against the glare of the sun on snow. Neighbor, uneasy, hunter maybe. Lorenz, shaking his head. A hunter leaves with what he kills. These don't come back. The men shifted, muttering, unwilling to get closer. The trail ended at the barn door. After that, nothing. Word spread in whispers. By afternoon, villagers at the tavern leaned close over mugs. Man, grimly, the snow keeps a record. Whoever went in never came out. They all laughed nervously, but no one had an answer. Inside the farmhouse, Andreas Gruber, stubborn, proud, brushed off the talk. Andreas gruffly, "Snow plays tricks. People see what they want to see." But even he had noticed the odd noises. At night, when the house should have been still, there were creaks above the ceiling, a faint shift like footsteps. When Victoria asked about it, he snapped. Andreas, snarling, "Wood contracts, mice in the beams, don't fill the children's heads with foolishness." But Victoria was not convinced, and neither was little Cecilia, who woke some nights trembling. Cecilia whispering to her mother, "Mama, someone's walking up there." Her mother hushed her with lullabies, though her own eyes stared long into the darkness. By the second day, the footprints had blurred at the edges, but they were still visible. Snow had fallen lightly, yet the line remained stark against the white field. Reminder, a warning. Andreas stood at the barn door, his hand on the wood. He paused, listening. The animals shuffled inside, their sounds muffled. The air was still, too still. Finally, he pulled the door open, stepping into the cool, straw-scented dark. Nothing unusual greeted him. Cows lowing, chickens scratching, tools in their places. And yet, he felt watched. He closed the door quickly, muttering to himself. Andreas, under his breath, "So what? Tracks in, no tracks out, means nothing." but the set of his jaw told another story. The villagers kept their distance. They told themselves it was nonsense, but at night, shutters closed a little earlier. Doors were checked twice, and always, in the back of their minds, the image lingered. Footprints leading to Hinterkaifeck, but never away. And though the wind would soon erase them, those footprints had already left their mark. For something had entered Hinterkaifeck, and it had no intention of leaving. The walls of Hinterkaifeck had always stood thick and silent, but silence does not mean peace. Inside those walls lived a family bound together, not by love, but by chains of duty, shame, and fear. At the head was Andreas Gruber, 63 years old, still strong, still harsh. He was a man carved from wood and iron, his temper as sharp as the mattock he used in the fields. To the villagers, he was stern, controlling, quick to anger. To his family, he was something far worse. His daughter Victoria bore the brunt of his authority. At 35, she should have been free, remarried perhaps, building a life of her own. Instead, she remained in the farmhouse, raising her children under the shadow of her father. Her husband, Karl Gabriel, had died in the war, or so it was said, but many whispered that Karl's death had been a kind of escape, a release from what he had seen at home. Victoria's youngest child, little Joseph, was the subject of the cruelest rumors. The boy had no father anyone could name with certainty. Some whispered that Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor, was the father. Others said something darker, that Joseph was Andreas's child, the product of an unholy bond forced upon Victoria. In the tavern, men lowered their voices when the subject came up. Villager one, muttering, "That child, he has Andreas's eyes." Villager two, uneasy, careful. Some things are better left unsaid, but the whispers never stopped. At supper, the family sat in silence, the weight of unspoken truths filling the air heavier than smoke. Victoria stared at her bowl, her hands trembling faintly as she spooned food for her daughter. Cecilia quietly to her mother, "Mama, why is Grandpa always so angry?" Victoria froze, her lips tightening. Before she could answer, Andreas slammed his spoon against the table. Andreas, snarling, "Eat your food. No questions." The room fell silent again. Only the crackle of the stove and the faint whimper of Joseph broke the stillness. The elder Cecilia, Andreas's wife, said nothing. She rarely did. Years of endurance had hollowed her into a shadow. She worked, she obeyed, she endured. Silence had become her survival. But outside the house, Victoria sought moments of escape. She had once turned to Lorenz Schlittenbauer for comfort. For a brief time, their affair had been known. He wanted to claim Joseph as his own. Andreas forbade it. Lorenz was pushed away, humiliated and bitter. That bitterness still simmered. Lorenz, to a friend bitterly, "He keeps her locked like a prisoner. She deserves more, That child deserves a father. The villagers noticed the way Victoria's eyes avoided Lorenz's now, full of shame, fear, and longing all at once. Night in the farmhouse was worst. Shadows pressed close. Silence grew louder. Victoria would sit by the window, staring out at the dark fields, the line of the woods etched against the sky. She whispered prayers, not of gratitude, but of desperation. Victoria, softly to herself, please, let there be a way out. But every morning, the farm held her tighter. The villagers said the land itself felt heavy, as if soaked in sorrow. They crossed it quickly, muttering under their breath. They saw Andrea's hard stare, Victoria's haunted eyes, the elder Cecilia's silence, and they knew something was very wrong inside that house. And though they could not see it, someone else knew too. Because in the quiet of those nights, while the family struggled under the weight of their own dark secrets, there was already another secret above them, pacing in the attic, listening to every word. The Grubers were not alone in their misery. For a brief time, another woman lived among them, carrying the same burdens, but with no blood ties to keep her bound. She came as a servant. She left in terror. Her name was Crescens Rieger. At first, she did what every maid on the farm was expected to do: cook, clean, tend to the endless cycle of chores. The house was stern but ordinary by day. It was night that broke her. In her small bed beneath the low ceiling, she began to hear it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing above her. Not the light patter of mice, not the house groaning under snow. These were heavier, human. The first time she told herself she had dreamed it. The second time she sat awake until dawn, listening, eyes wide. By the third night she could bear it no longer. At breakfast, her hands trembling, she spoke. Crescens, hesitant, voice low. Herr Gruber, there's someone in the attic. Andreas' eyes hardened. He set his spoon down with a sharp clatter. Andreas snapping. Nonsense. Wood shifts. Rats. Don't speak like a fool. Crescens pleading. No. I know footsteps when I hear them. Heavy ones walking above me. Andreas leaned forward, his voice cold. Andreas, I will not have servants spreading ghost stories. Do your work, leave the rest. Crescens lowered her head, but her fear only deepened. Soon she noticed other things, tools that vanished and reappeared, a key missing from its hook, only to turn up days later, a door she had bolted found open in the morning. One night she woke to something worse, a man's muffled laughter drifting down the stairwell. It was low, brief, and cut off quickly, but it froze blood. The next morning, she whispered to Victoria while kneading bread. Crescens whispering, terrified, "There's someone here. I heard him last night, laughing." Victoria's hands stilled. Her eyes flicked toward her father, then back to the dough. She spoke so quietly. Crescents barely heard. Victoria, low, strained, best not to speak of it. For your sake. The words landed heavier than any denial. Victoria knew she had heard it too, but silence was her only protection. From then on, Crescents carried a rosary constantly, whispering prayers under her breath. Neighbors saw her at church, pale and distracted, her hands white-knuckled around the beads. To a confidant, she finally confessed. Crescents whispering, "There's something in that house. It listens at night. It moves when no one else does. I feel it watching me. I can't stay there another night." And she didn't. Within days, she left the farm abruptly. No tearful farewells, no second thoughts. Just gone. The villagers wondered at her sudden departure. Some said Andreas had driven her away with his temper. Others believed she had discovered the family's shameful secrets, but Crescents herself told the truth in her final words about Hinterkaifeck. Crescents, to her friend, shaking, "That place is haunted, not by spirits, but by someone living inside it." The farmhouse fell silent again, its routines disrupted, its walls closing tighter around the family. And in that silence, new space had opened, waiting to be filled. The maid had fled in terror, believing she had escaped, but her absence left a vacancy, and someone, already hidden in the rafters, was ready to claim it. March 31st, 1922, a Friday. The sky hung low and gray, the snow patched and dirty along the road to Hinterkaifeck. The wind carried the bite of winter's last breath. It was on this day that Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm. She was 35 years old, plain-faced with gentle eyes and a limp in her step. Life had not been easy for her. Poverty, illness, and years of depending on others. When the chance for steady work came, she seized it. A maid's job, modest wages, food, and a bed. It was more than she had dared to hope for. Her sister walked beside her, boots crunching in the half-frozen. Maria carried a small satchel, possessions few. When they reached the farmhouse yard, her sister hesitated, staring at the dark windows. "Sister," quietly, "are you sure about this place?" Maria smiled, though the edges of it wavered. "Maria, it's honest work. Better than being a burden. Don't worry for me." But her sister's unease lingered. Sister, lowering her voice, "There's talk in the village. The last maid—" Maria cut her off with a firmness that surprised them both. "Maria, talk is just talk. People love their ghost stories. I will be fine here." Her sister nodded reluctantly, hugged her, and walked back down the path. Maria stood watching until she was gone, then turned toward the farmhouse. The house loomed against the trees, its roof sagging under snow, its windows like eyes that had seen too much. Inside, the Grubers received her with little warmth. Victoria greeted her with a tired nod, her eyes soft but worn. The elder Casilia managed a thin smile, her hands red and raw from years of work. Andreas barely looked up from his chair, muttering a grunt of acknowledgement, as though she were nothing more than another farm tool delivered for use. Maria set down her satchel and took in her new surroundings, the smell of smoke clinging to walls, the warped floorboards, the faint drip of melting snow seeping into the eaves. She told herself she could make this work. She needed to. That evening she was shown to her small room, a narrow bed, a wooden table, a single window looking out onto the barn. She unpacked her few clothes, folded them neatly, and placed a tiny wooden crucifix above her bed. She touched it with 2 fingers, whispering a prayer. Maria softly to herself, "Lord, let this be a good home. Let me serve them well." At supper, she tried to start conversation. The food was plain, soup and bread. She smiled politely, speaking with warmth. "Maria, gently. It's a quiet farm you keep here." A silence followed. Victoria glanced at her father. The elder Casilia stared at her bowl. Andreas finally growled, "Andreas, quiet is how it should be." Maria gave a small laugh. "Maria, yes, though too much quiet, I sometimes hear things that aren't there." At this, Victoria's spoon paused. The elder Casilia's hands twitched. Andreas scowled. Andreas, snapping, "Best not to imagine. This house has no need of foolishness." Maria lowered her gaze, cheeks warm with embarrassment. The silence that followed was heavier than before. That night, she lay in her bed, staring at the crucifix above her. The house creaked and sighed with the settling cold. She listened to the faint crackle of the stove dying out, to the wind pressing against the shutters. She thought of her sister, safe in her own bed, and whispered another prayer. Then she heard it, a creak above her ceiling. She froze. Another followed, deliberate, slow, as if someone was pacing directly overhead. Her heart pounded. She sat up, straining to hear. Maria whispering to herself, "Old wood, just the wood." But the sound came again. This time not a creak, but a faint shuffle. Maria clutched the crucifix tightly in her hands, whispering prayers under her breath. Slowly, the sounds faded, or perhaps she convinced herself they had. Exhaustion pulled at her until at last her eyes closed. Maria Baumgartner believed she had found honest work at Hinterkaifeck. She did not know that her first night in that bed would also be her last. By the end of March, the farmhouse no longer belonged entirely to the Grubers. They lived beneath its roof, yes. They ate at its table, they slept in its beds, but there was another presence in Hinterkaifeck now, one that stayed silent during the day and walked above them at night. It began as faint noises, creaks in the beams, the shuffle of weight, easy to dismiss as old timber, but soon the sounds grew bolder, unmistakable. One night, little Cecilia stirred in her bed. Moonlight stretched pale across the floorboards. She clutched at her mother's arm. Cecilia, whispering, "Mama, someone's up there." Victoria held her close, smoothing her hair. Her voice was calm, but her eyes flicked upward to the ceiling. Victoria, softly, "It's nothing, darling, just the wind." But in her chest, her heart hammered with fear. The next morning at breakfast, Maria whispered to Victoria as she set the bread on the table. Maria, low, nervous. "I heard it too. Steps. Last night, above my room." Victoria froze, her eyes searching Maria's face. She lowered her voice until it was barely more than breath. "Victoria, don't say it aloud. If we speak of it, it becomes real." Maria swallowed hard, but her hands trembled as she passed the food. Across the table, Andreas scowled, his spoon clattering against the bowl. Andreas, snapping, "Enough of this. No more foolishness. I'll hear no talk of footsteps." But even he had begun locking the barn door tighter at night. Even he kept his rifle within reach. Above them, hidden among rafters thick with dust, he crouched in silence. He had learned their patterns, the times they ate, the times they prayed, the songs Victoria hummed under her breath. He knew the weight of Andreas' boots, the laughter of the little girl, the nervous whisper of the maid. Every sound was a map, every voice a thread, and he had all the time in the world to listen. The house belonged to him now, and the family. They were simply waiting. At night the noises returned, sometimes faint creaks, other times deliberate pacing. Once a cough, choked back quickly but heard. Maria pressed a blanket to her mouth to smother her sobs. Victoria sat awake beside her daughter, whispering prayers until dawn. Even Andreas began to mutter curses as he walked the halls, as though anger could drive out what fear could not. But the watcher did not leave. Patience was his strength. He traced the haft of the mattock with his fingers, feeling its weight. Soon, he thought, not yet, but soon. One evening, as the fire guttered low, Victoria caught sight of something that froze her blood, the attic hatch above the hall. For just a moment, she thought she saw a shadow pulling back, as though someone had been watching through the gap. She blinked, and it was gone. She said nothing. Her silence was its own confession. The air inside Hinterkaifeck grew thicker each day, like the house itself was holding its breath. The family moved more quietly, their words clipped, their glances restless. The watcher's presence was no longer just suspected. It was felt. And still, no one dared to name it. The attic watcher had fed on their fear long enough, and soon he would no longer be content to remain above their heads. Soon he would come down. March 31st, 1922, evening. The farmhouse of Hinterkaifeck glowed faintly against the dark fields. Inside, the family sat down for supper, 6 souls, unaware that this would be their last meal together. The food was simple: bread, soup, a bit of boiled meat, but the air at the table was heavier than smoke. Fear hung over them like a shadow no one dared to name. Little Kazelia sat fidgeting with her spoon. Her voice broke the silence, small and trembling. Shazelia, quietly, "Mama, will he walk again tonight?" Victoria froze. Her hand tightened around her daughter's. Victoria, softly forcing calm, "Hush, darling. Eat your soup." But her eyes betrayed her, flicking upward toward the ceiling. Across the table, Maria glanced nervously at Victoria. Maria whispering, "I heard it again last night. The footsteps above me. It wasn't the house." Victoria's lips parted, but before she could speak, Andreas slammed his fist against the table. Andreas, furious, "Enough. There is no one here. I'll hear no more of this nonsense." The elder Kazelia flinched but stayed silent. Years had taught her silence was survival. The room fell into a suffocating hush, broken only by the crackle of the fire. He crouched in the rafters, listening. Their fear was a feast. The child's trembling voice, the maid's whisper, Andreas' anger, all of it was his. He ran his hand over the mattock's handle. Soon, after supper, Victoria tucked her children into bed. She kissed little Cecilia's forehead, brushing hair from her eyes. Cecilia whimpering, "Mama, don't let him take me." Victoria's throat tightened. She pulled the child close, rocking her gently. Victoria, whispering through tears, "No one will take you. Mama is here." But above them, in the attic, something shifted, listening, waiting. Maria sat awake in her small room, clutching her crucifix. Every creak made her heart stutter. She whispered prayers into the darkness. Maria whispering, "Lord, protect us tonight, please." Andreas walked the halls, muttering curses, his rifle in hand. But every shadow seemed to mock him. Every corner seemed too deep. The time had come. Patience had been his weapon, and now it was sharpened. One by one, he would silence them. It began in the barn. Perhaps Andreas went first, hearing a noise among the animals. Perhaps Cecilia Sr. followed to help. Perhaps Victoria, drawn by instinct, went after them. No one knows the exact order. But one by one, they stepped into the dark and did not return. The animals stirred nervously. A cow shifted, a chain clinked, straw rustled. Then came the sudden crack, the sickening thud of steel against bone, a muffled cry, another blow, then silence. One by one, the barn swallowed them. Andreas, the elder Cecilia, Victoria, little Cecilia, her cries choked in the dark, their bodies dragged into the hay, hidden as if the farm itself were swallowing its own. Inside the house, Maria stirred at the sound. She sat upright in her bed, clutching her crucifix. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Maria, dear God." What was that? The sound of footsteps came closer, not above her this time, but inside the house, slow, deliberate, coming down the hall. The door creaked open. A shadow filled the frame. Maria had only enough time for one last scream before the mattock fell. In the nursery, little Joseph slept soundly, swaddled in his crib. The shadow moved silently into the room. The baby stirred once, then silence at last. The house was quiet. No more whispers, no more footsteps but his own. Hinterkaifeck was his. By dawn, 6 lives had been extinguished. But the true horror was not the murders themselves. It was what came after. For the killer did not leave the farmhouse. He stayed. Morning broke over Hinterkaifeck with pale, indifferent light. Snow glittered across the fields. From the road, the farmhouse looked ordinary. A faint ribbon of smoke curled from the chimney. The animals shifted in their stalls. Life seemed to go on, but inside the barn, beneath the hay, lay the Grubers, silent, broken, hidden, 6 souls extinguished, their voices gone, and yet the farm lived. He moved through the house as if it were his own. There was no rush, no panic, only a new rhythm. He scattered feed for the chickens. He milked the cows. The steady hiss and patter of milk into the pail echoing in the stillness. He stoked the stove, the fire crackling to life once more. From a distance, no one would have guessed. Smoke rose, animals fed, the farm breathed, days passed, and still no one came. On Sunday, the choir sang at church. Victoria's voice was missing, her clear soprano silenced. People noticed, but said little. The little girl, too, was absent from school. Rumors began to stir in the tavern. Men leaned closer over mugs of beer. Man 1. Strange, isn't it? Not a sign of them since Friday. Man 2, shrugging. And yet the chimney smokes. The animals are fed. Man 3, uneasy. Perhaps they've no wish to be seen. They chuckled, but uneasily. Behind their laughter was fear. Meanwhile, inside Hinterkaifeck, Maria's room lay cold. The crucifix still hung crooked on the wall. Her bed was stained and straightened, as if someone had tried to erase her struggle. Victoria's hairbrush still sat on the dresser, strands caught in its teeth. The elder Cecilia's knitting remained on her chair, a single stitch frozen mid-loop. Life had stopped for the family, but the house was being kept alive. At night, he sat in Andrea's chair by the stove, staring into the flames. He wandered the halls, the floor creaking beneath his boots. He entered Victoria's room, lingering among her things. He ate their food, chewed their bread, drank from their cups. In the dark, he whispered to himself, "Intruder," muttering, "So quiet now. The house is mine." But even he felt uneasy among the children's toys. A wooden horse in the corner, small buttons lined neatly on a windowsill. 2 too many eyes. Even closed, they seemed to watch him. He kicked them aside, his breath ragged for the first time. On April 4th, 4 days after the murders, the postman Kaspar Stegmeier delivered letters to the farm. He noticed something odd. Victoria's mail lay untouched where he placed it. Still, the chimney smoked. He shrugged it off and left. That same day, a mechanic named Albert Hoffner came to repair the food chopper. He stood in the yard calling out. No one answered, yet inside he thought he heard faint movement, a shuffle, a cough. The animals stamped restlessly in their stalls. Hoffner repaired the machine, working uneasily for over an hour. At last, unsettled by the silence, he left. By then, the village's patience was wearing thin. On April 4th, Lorenz Schlittenbauer gathered 2 men, Jakob Siegel and Michael Pohl, and set out for Hinterkaifeck. The 3 men walked the familiar road, their boots crunching on frozen ground. The farmhouse loomed ahead, chimney smoke rising like nothing was wrong. But the silence in the yard felt wrong enough that their stomachs turned. They called out. No answer. When they entered the barn, the stench struck first, a heavy, sweet, sickly smell. They pulled back the hay, and the horror revealed itself. Andreas, the elder, Cecilia, Victoria, little Cecilia. Their skulls crushed, their faces ruined. One by one, they uncovered the family. Siegel staggered back, choking, dropped to his knees, crossing himself furiously. Lorenz stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide with something between grief and guilt. And then came the worst realization. Villager, voice trembling, the animals were fed, the fire was kept, whoever killed them, he was here, living among them. The Grubers were gone, but Hinterkaifeck was not empty, and in the days that followed, suspicion would tear the village apart, as everyone began to wonder if the killer was one of their own. When the bodies of the Grubers were discovered, horror gripped the village. But grief did not unite them, it divided them. For with no answers, suspicion grew like weeds, twisting through every conversation, poisoning every glance. The tavern filled with whispers first. Men hunched over mugs, their voices sharp and low. Villager one, grim. This was no stranger's work. Whoever did it knew that house. Villager 2, nodding. He lived there afterward, fed the animals, slept in their beds. Only someone who belonged could move so freely. Eyes shifted across the room, searching, accusing. The most obvious suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. His name hung heavy in every conversation. He had once courted Victoria. Some said he was Joseph's true father. Others believed Andreas had kept him from Victoria out of cruelty. Motive was easy to imagine. At the tavern, one man spat into the soda and muttered, "Man 1, he found the bodies first. He led them straight to the barn, too quick, too certain, as if he already knew. Man 2, and he went back again and again. Who revisits such horror unless they are tied to it? But not all agreed. Woman, firmly, he lost his wife. Do you think he'd stain his hands with this? I saw him that day, pale as death. He shook like a leaf. The room argued. suspicion thickening like smoke. Then came the talk of neighbors with grudges. Andreas was not beloved. He was harsh, prideful, quick to quarrel. More than one farmer had crossed him over fences, debts, or stubborn disputes. Old farmer muttering, "Andreas made enemies." Too many. Maybe one finally took their chance. Names were tossed out carelessly, each one catching fire for a night before fading. Suspicion spared no one, but the darkest whispers circled back to the family itself. The incest rumors returned, louder, now tied directly to the murders. Victoria and Andreas, Joseph's parentage. People began to say the killings were not murder, but punishment. At church, women whispered behind their veils. Woman one hushed. It was God's hand, judgment for their sins. Woman two crossing herself. Then God's hand carries a mattock. Even the priest's sermons grew cautious, his eyes lingering too long on the pew where the Grubers once sat. And then came the most chilling theory of all, the name of Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband. A soldier said to have fallen in the war, but what if he hadn't? In the tavern, a man leaned in close, his breath sour with beer. Man whispering, what if he came back, scarred, changed, found his wife with another man's child? What then? The idea took root. Some scoffed, others swore they saw a figure in the village days before, a man with a soldier's gait, watching from the edge of the fields. Was Karl Gabriel truly dead? Or had he returned, cloaked in rage? The police investigation offered little relief. They questioned everyone, press and villagers, for alibis, but instead of clearing names, it only deepened suspicion. Each denial sounded false. Each alibi felt rehearsed. Neighbors who once shared bread now crossed the road to avoid one another. Wives clutched their children closer. Men locked their doors at dusk. The village had become a stage for paranoia. Old woman to her daughter whispering, "Do not trust anyone. Whoever did this still walks among us." And she was right. Or so they believed. When no human guilt could be proven, the villagers turned to something older, darker. They began to believe the land itself was cursed, that Hinterkaifeck was hungry and had finally taken its fill. After the bodies were buried, after the questions grew stale, the village was left with something worse than answers: silence. And in that silence, the story of Hinterkaifeck began to change. It became less a crime and more a curse. In the tavern, old men lowered their voices as though the very walls might be listening. Elder villager gravely, "That ground has never been right. You feel it the moment you step onto the yard, too heavy, too still." Another nodded, fingers tight on his mug. Man, my grandfather told me no good ever came from those fields. The earth remembers blood. The others crossed themselves, not daring to laugh. Soon the tales grew. Some swore the farm was built on cursed land, an old battlefield, a burial ground, a place where the earth itself demanded payment. Others claimed to see strange lights hovering above the tree line, flickering green like lanterns carried by the dead. And then there were the voices. Travelers passing the road at night reported hearing whispers carried on the wind. Sometimes a man's voice muttering low, sometimes a woman's sob. One swore he heard the sound of a child crying in the dark. At church, women clutched their rosaries tighter, woman whispering. 6 souls taken in their own home. That house, it drinks sorrow. It will never be clean. Companion nodded, voice trembling. Second woman, it doesn't want peace. It wants more. Children dared each other to creep near the farm. They ran screaming when the shutters banged in the wind. Carts no longer passed the road after dusk. Even the boldest men felt eyes on their backs if they lingered too long at the fence line. One traveler years later told of a night he saw a figure standing in the attic window. Traveler, terrified at the tavern. I swear to you, there was someone there, watching. His eyes, they glowed like embers. The villagers fell silent, none daring to contradict him. And so the farm became legend. Not just a place where murder had happened, but a place where the earth itself had swallowed a family whole. The name Hinterkaifeck was no longer spoken casually. It was muttered like a warning. An old woman told her granddaughter as they passed the overgrown path, "Grandmother," softly, "it is not the people who are cursed, child. It is the land. The house drinks sorrow, the soil drinks blood, and when it is hungry again." She never finished the thought. She didn't need to. Even after the farmhouse was torn down years later, people said the land never grew quiet. The fields lay empty, the wind howled through the trees, but travelers claimed they still saw shadows moving where no house stood. The curse, they said, had not been buried, and that is why even today Hinterkaifeck is spoken of not just as a crime, but as a place where something darker still lingers, waiting. Hinterkaifeck was torn down years after the murders. The walls that had held secrets were reduced to rubble. The roof that had sheltered shadows caved to dust. Yet even without the house, the story did not die. It lingered, clinging to the land, passed in whispers, in rumors, in nightmares. Theories swirled as they always do. Some pointed to Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who had once loved Victoria. Was jealousy his motive? Was guilt the reason he returned again and again to the scene of the crime? Others blamed enemies of Andreas, men with grudges, men who had felt the weight of his cruelty and snapped. And still others turned to the ghost of Karl Gabriel, the husband said to have died in the war. What if he had lived, returning disfigured, enraged, to find his wife with another man's child? What if the war had turned him into something unrecognizable, something capable of this? but there were darker whispers still, whispers that the killer was not a man at all, that Hinterkaifeck itself demanded blood, that the watcher in the attic was never flesh and bone, but something older, something tied to the cursed soil, feeding until the house could hold no more. The investigators found no answers, no arrest was ever made, no confession ever surfaced. Files filled with contradictions, testimonies clashed, suspects came and went, but the truth remained buried. And so Hinterkaifeck became a riddle with no solution, a shadow with no source. To this day, people still walk by the empty fields. They say the air feels heavier there, the wind quieter. Some swear they hear footsteps crunching behind them in the snow, only to turn and find no one there. Others claim that at night, when the moon is thin and the fields are silent, you can still see a flicker of light, a glow where the farmhouse once stood. The land, they say, remembers. The true horror of Hinterkaifeck is not just in the blood spilled, nor in the silence of its unsolved mystery. It is in the fact that no one knows. The killer was never found, the curse was never lifted, the watcher in the attic was never named, and perhaps the most terrifying thought of all is this: whoever or whatever took the lives at Hinterkaifeck may not be finished. Perhaps even now it waits in another attic, listening until night falls again.